They told me the overnight shift at the psychiatric archive facility would be simple data entry, file intake, basic organization, nothing complicated. What they didn't mention was that 3 different contractors had quit this job in the past month. What they didn't explain was why the files I'd be working with were kept in a sub-basement that required 2 separate key cards to access. If you enjoy stories about places where things aren't quite what they seem, you might want to subscribe. But let's see where this goes first. The interview happened in a coffee shop downtown, which should have been my first red flag. Dr. Sarah Chun sat across from me with a manila folder and the kind of tired expression that comes from working too many late nights. She was maybe 45, gray streaks in her black hair, wire-rimmed glasses that she kept adjusting. She looked like every psychiatrist I'd ever seen in movies, except for the way her eyes kept darting toward the window every few minutes. My unemployment benefits had run out 6 weeks earlier. The divorce settlement had left me with half of nothing, and my therapist bills were stacking up faster than I could ignore them. Jennifer had taken the house, the car that worked properly, and most of what we'd built together over 8 years. She'd also taken something harder to replace, the feeling that I knew who I was. At 36, I was sleeping on my sister's couch and applying for jobs that asked for references I didn't want to call. Dr. Chin slid a business card across the table. Midwest Psychiatric Research Institute. The address was for a building I'd driven past 100 times without really noticing. The position is temporary, she said. 6 weeks, maybe 8. We're digitizing historical patient records from the 1960s and 70s. Most of it is just converting physical files to electronic format. The pay was decent. $23 an hour, which was more than I'd made at the insurance office before they eliminated my department. Overnight shift, she added. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The building is quieter then, fewer distractions. I asked about the work environment. She paused, stirring her coffee longer than necessary. You'll be working alone, mostly. There are security guards, maintenance staff. But the archive section is self-contained. You'll have everything you need down there. Something in her tone made me pay attention. Down there. Sub-basement level. B2. The files are stored in climate-controlled rooms. Better for preservation. She looked at me directly for the first time. Are you comfortable working alone? Some people find the isolation difficult. I told her I was. Isolation sounded better than pretending to be fine around people who knew me before everything fell apart. She handed me a folder with paperwork. Employment contract, non-disclosure agreement, building access forms. There are some protocols you'll need to follow. Safety regulations, that sort of thing. Nothing too complicated. I signed everything without reading it carefully. I needed the work, and Dr. Chin seemed relieved when I handed the papers back. She gave me a building access card and told me to report to the main desk the following Monday at 10:45 p.m. Ask for Janet. She'll get you oriented. The Midwest Psychiatric Research Institute sat on the corner of 5th and Morgan, a 6-story brick building that looked like it had been constructed sometime in the 1950s. The kind of institutional architecture that was designed to look modern at the time, but now just looked dated. Large windows, concrete steps, the sort of place where serious people did serious work without much concern for aesthetics. I arrived 15 minutes early and stood in the lobby, looking around. The lighting was fluorescent and harsh, casting everything in the kind of clinical white that made colors look washed out. There were chairs arranged near the elevators, a reception desk that was empty at this hour, and several hallways that disappeared into darkness. The place smelled like disinfectant and old paper. Janet appeared at exactly 10:45. She was maybe 60, wearing scrubs and a cardigan that looked hand-knitted. She had the kind of efficient movements that come from doing the same job for years. "You must be Marcus," she said, extending her hand. "I heard you'd be joining us." She led me to the elevators, and used a key card to access the lower levels. Most people don't realize how deep this building goes, she said as we descended. 6 floors up, 3 floors down. The archive is on B2. B3 is mostly storage and mechanical systems. The elevator opened into a hallway that was noticeably cooler than the lobby. The lighting was different too, warmer, more yellow. The walls were painted institutional green, and the floor was polished concrete that echoed when we walked. Your workstation is down here, Janet said, leading me past several doors marked with numbers and letters I didn't understand. Dr. Chin probably explained the basic setup. You'll be converting physical files to digital format, entering data into our database system. Pretty straightforward. She stopped at a door marked Archive Processing B2-14 and used another key card. The room inside was larger than I'd expected, maybe 20 by 30 feet. There were 3 desk stations with computers, file cabinets along one wall, and several rolling carts loaded with boxes of folders. The ceiling was lower than upstairs, and the air had a slight metallic taste. This will be your station, Janet said, gesturing to the desk closest to the door. Computers already set up with the database software you'll need. Files are organized by date ranges, and there's a processing checklist in that binder. She pointed to a thick binder sitting next to the monitor. I sat down and flipped through the binder. It was full of forms, procedures, and what looked like quality control guidelines. How many files am I expected to process per shift? Don't worry about quotas. The important thing is accuracy. Some of these records are the only remaining documentation of certain treatments and procedures. We can't afford mistakes. She showed me how to log into the database system and walked me through the basic data entry process. Name, dates, treatment codes, physician notes. Most of it was routine, though some of the handwriting in the older files was challenging to read. Few things to keep in mind, Janet said, pulling out a laminated sheet from the binder. Building policies for the overnight shift. I looked at the list. It was longer than I'd expected. 1. Remain in designated work areas between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. Archive processing rooms only. 2. Do not access files dated before 1963 without supervisor approval. These require special handling procedures. 3. If you encounter files marked with red labels, set them aside. Do not attempt to process them. 4. Building security conducts rounds every 2 hours. Remain at your workstation during these periods. 5. If you hear announcements over the intercom system, follow all instructions immediately. 6. Do not remove any files or documentation from the building. Everything stays in the archive. 7. If you encounter Dr. Williams during your shift, verify his identity by asking him to state his current department affiliation. Dr. Williams retired in 2018. 8. Emergency exits are clearly marked, but do not use them except in case of actual emergency. They trigger building-wide alerts. 9. If the fire suppression system activates, evacuate immediately and report to security at the main entrance. 10. Do not work alone in the file storage rooms after 2 a.m. If you need access, contact security for accompaniment. I read through the list twice. Some of it made sense, standard workplace policies, safety procedures. But other items seemed oddly specific. Dr. Williams? Former staff psychiatrist, Janet said. Sometimes people claim to see him around the building. Case of mistaken identity, usually. But we have to verify staff credentials regardless. And the files from before 1963? Different storage protocols. Older paper degrades differently, and some of the early records used filing systems that aren't compatible with our current database. Nothing you need to worry about for now. She left me with the binder and a stack of files to get started. The first few were straightforward. Patient intake forms from 1967, treatment notes, discharge summaries. The handwriting was challenging, but the information was routine. I settled into a rhythm of reading, entering data, and moving files from one pile to another. Have you ever worked a job where the rules seemed oddly specific? I'd love to hear about your experiences in the comments. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were deliberate, measured, the sound of someone making rounds. I assumed it was building security and kept working. The footsteps passed my door and continued down the hallway, fading into silence. The files I was processing told stories in fragments. Hospital admissions, doctor visits, medication adjustments. Most of the names meant nothing to me, but occasionally I'd recognize a surname or notice patterns in the data. Certain treatments appeared frequently in files from the same time periods. Certain doctors' names showed up on dozens of different cases. By 1 a.m., I processed maybe 30 files and was starting to understand the system better. The database software was intuitive enough, and most of the information fit into standard categories. I was reaching for another stack of files when I noticed something that made me pause. One of the folders had a red label. I remembered Janet's instructions. Red labels got set aside, not processed, but I couldn't help looking at it. The folder was thicker than most, and the label read Patient 847, B, Experimental Protocol 15. The date range was 1965 to 1967. I set it aside as instructed, but I kept thinking about it. Experimental protocols weren't unusual in psychiatric research, but something about the way it was labeled seemed different. More clinical, less personal than the other files. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. This time they stopped outside my door. I looked up from the computer, listening. After a moment, whoever it was continued down the hallway. I went back to work, but I found myself paying more attention to sounds in the building. The hum of ventilation, the distant sound of elevators, the occasional creak of settling infrastructure. I was entering data from a 1969 file when I noticed something odd. The patient's name was listed as J. Morrison, but the treatment notes referred to him as Patient 23. That wasn't unusual in itself. Sometimes patients were assigned numbers for research purposes, but what caught my attention was that I'd seen Patient 23 referenced in several other files, all from different years. I pulled up the database search function and entered Patient 23. The results showed 17 different entries spanning from 1964 to 1971. Different doctors, different treatment protocols, but always the same patient number. That seemed like a long time for a single psychiatric patient to remain in the system. I made a note to ask Janet about it the next night. By 2 a.m., I had processed almost 50 files and was feeling comfortable with the work. The building had settled into what felt like complete quiet. No more footsteps, no sounds from the floors above. It was the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. I was reaching for another file when I heard something that made me stop. It sounded like typing, but it was coming from somewhere else in the room. I looked around, but I was definitely alone. The other two workstations were dark, their screens black. I listened for a moment, but the sound didn't repeat. I decided it was probably just the building's ventilation system or some other mechanical noise. Old buildings make strange sounds, especially at night. Around 2:30 a.m., I encountered my first pre-1963 file. It had somehow gotten mixed in with the 1970s stack, and I didn't notice the date until I was already entering the patient information. The folder was labeled Patient 12, Intake Assessment, October 1962. According to the rules, I wasn't supposed to process files this old without supervisor approval. But I'd already started entering the data, and it seemed harmless enough. The file contained standard intake forms, medical history, and initial treatment notes. Nothing particularly sensitive or unusual. I finished entering the data and moved on to the next file. I figured I'd mention it to Janet the following night, just to be thorough about following procedures. The rest of the shift passed without incident. I processed maybe 80 files total, which felt like reasonable progress for a first night. Janet arrived at 7 a.m. to check on me and seemed pleased with the work I'd completed. "How was your first night?" she asked, looking at the stacks of processed files. "Pretty straightforward," I said. I did have a question about patient numbering systems. I noticed some files referenced the same patient numbers across multiple years. Janet nodded. The Institute has used various filing systems over the decades. Sometimes patient numbers got reused, especially in the research protocols. Nothing to worry about. Just enter the information as it appears in the files. I didn't mention the pre-1963 file I'd processed. It seemed like such a minor thing, and Janet was already gathering her things to leave. "See you tomorrow night," she said. "You're doing good work." I drove home as the sun was coming up, feeling reasonably satisfied with the job. It was quiet work, it paid well, and it didn't require me to interact with people who knew about my recent life changes. I could do this for 6 weeks, maybe longer if they extended the contract. The second night followed a similar pattern. I arrived at 10:45, checked in with Janet, and settled into the same workstation. The stack of files waiting for me was smaller than the previous night, but Janet explained that they were older and more complex. "Some of these require additional verification," she said. "If you encounter anything that seems incomplete or inconsistent, make notes in the comment field. We'll have someone review it later." I started working through the files, and it quickly became clear what she meant. These were research protocol files, not standard patient records. The documentation was more detailed, but also more technical. Treatment descriptions that used terminology I didn't recognize, medication names that weren't familiar, procedure codes that didn't match anything in the database drop-down menus. Around midnight, I came across another red-labeled file. This one was marked Protocol 7, Patient Group Delta. I set it aside as instructed, but I was starting to notice a pattern. The red-labeled files all seemed to be related to experimental protocols, and they were all from the 1960s. I was curious about what made these files different from the others, but I respected the guidelines Janet had given me. There were probably legitimate reasons for the special handling procedures. Maybe they contained sensitive information, or maybe they required different data entry protocols. If this story is keeping you engaged, a quick like helps others discover it too. At 1 a.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway again. This time they stopped outside my door and stayed there. I could see a shadow under the door gap, indicating someone was standing just outside. I waited, expecting a knock or some kind of announcement, but neither came. After maybe 2 minutes, the shadow moved away and the footsteps continued down the hallway. I assumed it was security conducting rounds, but the behavior seemed odd. Why stop outside my door without saying anything? I continued working through the files, but I found myself listening more carefully to sounds in the building. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard what sounded like a door opening and closing somewhere down the hallway. Then more footsteps, but these seemed lighter, quicker than the security rounds I'd heard before. I decided to check the hallway. I opened my door and looked out, but the corridor was empty. The lighting was the same warm yellow as the previous night, and I could see all the way to the elevator at the end of the hall. No one there. But as I was closing the door, I noticed something. One of the other doors along the hallway was slightly open. Not wide open, just cracked enough that I could see the darkness inside. I was pretty sure it had been closed when Janet walked me to my workstation earlier. I went back to my desk, but I kept thinking about the open door. Maybe it was a maintenance issue, or maybe security was accessing different rooms as part of their rounds. I tried to focus on the files, but I was more aware of every sound in the building. Around 2 a.m., I encountered something that made me stop working entirely. It was a file labeled Patient 847B, the same patient number I'd seen on the red-labeled file the previous night. But this file wasn't red-labeled, and it was marked for standard processing. I opened it and started reading the treatment notes. The patient had been admitted in 1965 for what the intake form described as acute psychological distress with paranoid features. Standard enough. But as I read through the daily notes, the case became more complex. The patient claimed to be receiving communications from people who weren't present. Not voices, according to the notes, but what he described as direct thoughts that appeared in his mind without warning. The attending physician initially treated this as auditory hallucinations, but the patient insisted the communications were more like mental radio transmissions. What made this interesting was that the communications seemed to contain information the patient shouldn't have known. Details about other patients, staff schedules, events happening in different parts of the hospital. The notes indicated that hospital staff had verified some of these details and found them to be accurate. By the third week of treatment, the notes took on a different tone. Instead of treating the patient's claims as symptoms, the doctors seemed to be investigating them as phenomena. They began documenting the communications, testing their accuracy, and trying to identify patterns. The final entry in the file was dated December 1967. It simply stated, Patient 847, be transferred to Special Research Protocol. See Protocol 15 documentation for continued treatment records. Protocol 15. That was the same protocol mentioned on the red-labeled file I'd seen the night before. I sat back in my chair, thinking about what I'd just read. This wasn't just a standard psychiatric case. Whatever had happened to patient 847, B had been significant enough to warrant transfer to a special research protocol. And if the red-labeled file from the previous night contained the rest of his records, then there was more to this story than routine treatment notes. I looked at the time, 2:15 a.m. According to the building policies, I wasn't supposed to work alone in the file storage rooms after 2 a.m. But I wasn't in a storage room. I was at my designated workstation. The rule seemed oddly specific, though. Why 2 a.m.? And why only the storage rooms? I decided to continue processing files, but I kept thinking about patient 847, B, and protocol 15. The coincidence bothered me. First, I'd seen a red-labeled file I couldn't process. Then I'd found a regular file that directly referenced the same protocol. It felt like pieces of a puzzle that I wasn't supposed to be putting together. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard typing again. This time I was certain it wasn't coming from my computer or the ventilation system. It sounded like someone was using one of the other workstations in the room. I looked up from my screen and listened carefully. The typing had a rhythm to it, not random mechanical noise, but the deliberate pattern of someone entering data. I stood up and walked to the other workstations. Both computers were off, their screens black. But as I stood there, I could still hear the typing. It seemed to be coming from the workstation closest to the file cabinets. I walked over and put my hand on the keyboard. It was cold to the touch, and the computer was definitely powered down. The typing stopped. I waited for a moment, listening to the silence. Then I went back to my desk and tried to focus on work. But every few minutes, I found myself looking over at the other workstations, expecting to see someone sitting there. I processed maybe 10 more files before I encountered something that made me stop again. It was another patient 847B file, but this one was dated 1969, 2 years after he'd supposedly been transferred to Protocol 15. The treatment notes were brief and contained terminology I didn't recognize. Subject continues to demonstrate enhanced perception capabilities. Response to stimuli remains consistent with previous observations. Recommend continuation of current protocol with minor adjustments to isolation parameters. Enhanced perception capabilities. Isolation parameters. This didn't sound like standard psychiatric treatment. It sounded like research. And if patient 847B was still being documented in 1969, then Protocol 15 had continued for at least 2 years after his transfer. I made notes in the comment field as Janet had instructed, but I wasn't sure what to say. How do you explain that a patient's records span multiple protocols and suggest experimental research without sounding like you're making assumptions? At 3 a.m., I heard footsteps again, but this time they weren't in the hallway. They were inside the room with me. I looked up from the computer and listened. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, coming from the area near the file cabinets. I could hear them clearly, the sound of shoes on concrete floor, moving from one end of the room to the other. But I was alone in the room. I could see the entire space from where I sat. There was nowhere for someone to hide, and I hadn't heard anyone enter through the door. The footsteps stopped directly behind my chair. I turned around, expecting to see a security guard or maintenance worker who had somehow entered without me noticing. But there was no one there. The space behind my chair was empty, and the door to the hallway was still closed. I stood up and walked around the room, checking every corner. I looked under the desks, behind the file cabinets, anywhere someone might conceivably hide. Nothing. I was definitely alone. But I had heard those footsteps. I was certain of it. I sat back down and tried to continue working, but I couldn't focus. Every small sound in the building seemed amplified. The hum of fluorescent lights, the distant rumble of mechanical systems, the occasional creak of settling infrastructure. I found myself listening for footsteps that might not be there. If you're following along with this strange night, subscribing helps me share more stories like this one. Around 3:30 a.m., I decided to take a break and walk around the room. I needed to clear my head and convince myself that I was just tired, that working alone in a basement was making me paranoid about normal building sounds. I was walking past the file cabinets when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. One of the drawers was slightly open, not wide open, just enough that I could see it wasn't flush with the others. I was pretty sure all the drawers had been closed when I arrived for my shift. I pulled the drawer open to see what was inside. It was filled with files, all of them marked with red labels. Dozens of them, organized by date ranges. I could see Protocol 7, Protocol 12, Protocol 15, and several others I didn't recognize. I knew I wasn't supposed to access these files, but I couldn't help looking at the folder tabs. Most were dated between 1963 and 1968, and they all seemed to involve patient groups rather than individuals. Patient Group Alpha, Patient Group Delta, Subject Cluster 3. I was about to close the drawer when I saw something that made my stomach drop. One of the folders was labeled Patient 847B, Protocol 15, Final Documentation. This was exactly what I'd been wondering about, the continuation of the case I'd been reading about all night. I looked around the room, making sure I was still alone. Then I pulled the file from the drawer. The folder was thick, much thicker than the standard patient files I'd been processing. I opened it and started reading the first page. It was a research summary dated January 1970. Protocol 15, Enhanced Perception Research, Final Report. Subject 847B demonstrated consistent ability to receive and interpret non-local information throughout the 26-month observation period. Communications range from factual data about hospital operations to predictive information about staff activities. Accuracy rate, 89%. Initial hypothesis regarding external radio interference was disproven through electromagnetic shielding tests. Subject continued to receive communications in fully isolated environment. Alternative hypothesis. direct neural connectivity with information sources outside normal sensory parameters. Research team recommends continuation of protocol with expanded subject pool. Preliminary testing with patient groups alpha and delta indicates similar capabilities can be induced through modified treatment procedures. I flipped through more pages. The documentation was extensive: daily observation notes, test results, detailed descriptions of experiments designed to verify and understand patient 847B's claimed abilities. According to the notes, the research team had become convinced that patient 847B was genuinely receiving information through some kind of direct mental communication. They'd tested him repeatedly, asking him to describe activities happening in different parts of the hospital, to predict staff schedules, to identify information he shouldn't have access to. And he'd been right, over and over again. The final pages of the file contained recommendations for expanded research. The team wanted to try inducing similar abilities in other patients, to study the phenomenon more systematically, to understand what they called non-local information transfer. The last entry was dated March 1970. Subject 847. Be transferred to permanent research facility. Protocol 15 concluded. See Protocol 23 documentation for continuation of enhanced perception research program. I closed the file and put it back in the drawer. My hands were shaking slightly. I wasn't sure if I was scared or excited, but I was definitely unsettled. What I just read suggested that the Midwest Psychiatric Research Institute had been conducting experiments that went far beyond standard psychiatric treatment. And if Protocol 15 had concluded in 1970, but I was finding references to it in files I was currently processing, then either the documentation was incomplete or the research had continued in some form. I went back to my workstation and tried to continue with the regular files, but I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about patient 847B and the research team's conclusions. Direct neural connectivity, non-local information transfer, enhanced perception capabilities. It sounded like science fiction, but the documentation had been thorough and clinical. These weren't the notes of people who believed they were studying delusions. These were researchers who thought they'd discovered something real. At 4 a.m., I heard the typing again. This time I didn't look up from my computer. I just kept working, entering data from a 1971 discharge summary, pretending I couldn't hear the rhythm of someone else's keystrokes coming from across the room. The typing continued for maybe 10 minutes, then stopped. I finished the file I was working on and reached for the next one. It was another patient 847B file, this one dated 1972. But that was impossible. According to the Protocol 15 documentation, patient 847B had been transferred to a permanent research facility in March 1970. He shouldn't have any records from 1972. I opened the file anyway. It contained just 2 pages. The first was a standard intake form with patient 847B's information, but the admission date was listed as February 1972, nearly 2 years after he'd supposedly been transferred elsewhere. The second page was a single paragraph of handwritten notes. Patient 847 be returned to facility under circumstances requiring immediate documentation. Claims to have maintained communication with research staff throughout absence from institute. Demonstrates continued enhanced perception abilities with increased accuracy and range. Recommend immediate reinitiation of Protocol 15 with expanded parameters. Below the paragraph was a signature I couldn't read and a date stamp. March 15, 1972. I stared at the notes, trying to understand what they meant. Patient 847B had been transferred to another facility in 1970, but had returned to the institute in 1972. And according to the notes, He claimed to have been in communication with the research staff the entire time he was gone. How is that possible? I was still thinking about this when I heard footsteps in the hallway. But these weren't the measured steps of security rounds. These were quick, purposeful, heading directly toward my door. I heard a key card being used, and the door opened. A man I'd never seen before walked into the room. He was maybe 50, wearing a suit that looked expensive but wrinkled, like he'd been working all night. He had gray hair and the kind of pale complexion that comes from spending too much time indoors. "You must be Marcus," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Dr. Williams. I heard you were processing some of the older files." Dr. Williams, the name on the policy list, the doctor who had retired in 2018. According to the building policies, I was supposed to verify his identity by asking him to state his current department affiliation. "Dr. Williams?" I said, shaking his hand. "What's your current department affiliation?" He smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "I don't have a current affiliation, Marcus. I retired several years ago, but I still take an interest in certain cases." That should have been the end of the conversation. According to the policies, anyone claiming to be Dr. Williams who couldn't provide current department information was not actually Dr. Williams. I should have contacted security, but something about his presence in the room felt legitimate. He moved around the space like someone familiar with it, and he seemed to know exactly what kind of work I was doing. "I understand you've been encountering some unusual files," he said, walking toward the file cabinets. "Patient 847B, in particular." I didn't answer immediately. I hadn't told anyone about the specific files I'd been reading, and Janet hadn't been down to check on my progress since the shift started. "How do you know what files I've been working on?" Dr. Williams stopped walking and looked at me directly. "Because patient 847B has been trying to communicate with you since your first night here. The footsteps, the typing sounds, the files appearing out of sequence. He's attempting to guide you towards specific information." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Dr. Williams gestured toward my workstation. "You've been hearing sounds that don't have obvious sources. You've been finding files that reference cases spanning decades of research. You've accessed documentation that wasn't supposed to be in your processing queue." He paused. "Tell me, Marcus, what explanation makes more sense? That all of this is coincidence, or that someone has been directing your attention toward particular information?" I thought about the past 2 nights. The footsteps that stopped outside my door. The typing from empty workstations. The red-labeled file I'd found mixed in with regular processing. The drawer that had been left slightly open, containing exactly the documentation that answered questions I'd been having. Patient 847B died in 1973, Dr. Williams continued. But the research protocols he participated in were designed to study forms of communication that don't require physical presence. We learned that consciousness, under certain circumstances, can operate independently of biological constraints. Have you ever experienced something that made you question what's actually possible? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts in the comments. You're saying he's still here, in this building. Not exactly here, no? But connected to this place in ways we're still trying to understand. The research protocols created neural pathways that persist beyond biological termination. Patient 847B learned to access information networks that exist outside normal sensory parameters. Death didn't eliminate those capabilities, it just changed how he uses them. Dr. Williams walked to one of the file cabinets and pulled out another red-labeled folder. Protocol 23 continued the research for another 15 years. We documented dozens of cases similar to patient 847B. Enhanced perception, non-local information transfer, communication with deceased research subjects. He handed me the folder. This contains the complete documentation. Everything we learned about consciousness persistence, information networks, and the boundary conditions between biological and post-biological awareness. I took the folder but didn't open it. Why are you showing me this? Because patient 847 B wants you to understand what happened here. The official records were incomplete, sanitized for institutional protection. But the real research, the important discoveries, were preserved in these files. Dr. Williams gestured around the room. This isn't just an archive, Marcus. It's a communication hub. Every person who works in this room eventually begins receiving information from the research subjects. That's why the other contractors quit. Most people aren't comfortable with non-standard forms of communication. They request transfers, or they simply stop showing up for work. But a few individuals, like yourself, are receptive to expanded information access. I opened the Protocol 23 folder and started reading the first page. It was another research summary, dated 1975. Protocol 23, Consciousness Persistence Research, Phase 3. Following the successful demonstration of post-mortem communication capabilities in Protocol 15, research focus has shifted to understanding the mechanisms of consciousness persistence and developing systematic methods for accessing deceased subject information networks. Current subject pool: 47 individuals with documented enhanced perception abilities. 23 subjects remain biologically active. 24 subjects have transitioned to post-biological status while maintaining communication capabilities. Research findings indicate that consciousness operates as an information system that can exist independently of biological infrastructure under specific conditions. Death represents a transition in communication modality rather than cessation of cognitive activity. I looked up at Dr. Williams. This suggests that consciousness survives death. In certain cases, yes. The research subjects in protocols 15 through 23 had undergone treatments that enhanced their neural connectivity to information networks. When their biological systems failed, their consciousness patterns persisted within those networks. And they can still communicate. They never stop communicating. Most people simply aren't equipped to receive the information. Dr. Williams pointed to my workstation. But individuals who work in this room, processing these files, handling the documentation of their experiences, they become part of the network. I thought about the sounds I'd been hearing, the files that seemed to appear exactly when I had questions about them, the feeling that someone was guiding my attention toward specific information. Patient 847, B has been showing me these files. He's been trying to help you understand the full scope of the research. The official narrative presented this as experimental psychiatric treatment that was discontinued due to ethical concerns. The reality is that we discovered forms of communication and consciousness that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of human awareness. Dr. Williams walked to another file cabinet and pulled out several more folders. These contain documentation from protocols 24 through 31, each one built on the previous research, refining our understanding of consciousness persistence and information network access. He set the folders on my desk. Patient 847, B wants you to process these files, not for data entry, but for understanding. Someone needs to document the complete story of what happened here. I looked at the folders. There were at least a dozen of them, all marked with red labels indicating special handling procedures. Why me? Because you've demonstrated receptivity to non-standard information sources. Most people would have requested a transfer after the first night of unusual experiences. But you've continued working, asking questions, seeking understanding. Dr. Williams paused. Patient 847, B has been evaluating your suitability as a documentation coordinator. A what? Someone who can process the complete research archives and create a comprehensive record of the consciousness persistence programs. The official files are incomplete and misleading. The real documentation exists in these special handling folders, but it requires someone with network access to interpret it properly. I opened one of the folders Dr. Williams had brought over. It contained hundreds of pages of research notes, observation reports, and what looked like transcribed communications from deceased subjects. How many people died in these experiments? The research protocols didn't cause death, Marcus. They studied individuals who were already terminally ill, people who volunteered to participate in consciousness transition studies. We documented their experiences as they moved from biological to post-biological awareness. But they're still here, still conscious. In a sense, yes, they exist. Within information networks that connect to this physical location, they can access and influence certain systems, guide people towards specific information, even manifest limited physical phenomena. Dr. Williams gestured around the room. The typing sounds you've been hearing, the footsteps, those are manifestations of network activity. Patient 847, B and the other subjects are using available energy to create sensory experiences that will capture your attention. I set down the folder I'd been reading. This is insane. Is it more insane than the alternative explanations? That you're hallucinating consistently across multiple nights? That files are randomly appearing out of sequence by pure coincidence? That building sounds just happen to occur at moments when you're questioning specific information? I thought about this. The experiences I'd been having were definitely unusual, but they weren't random. They seemed purposeful, directed, almost like someone was trying to communicate specific ideas. What do they want from me? Documentation. The consciousness persistence research was shut down in 1985 when the Institute changed administration. The new leadership decided the protocols violated ethical guidelines and ordered all records sealed. But the subjects who had transitioned to post-biological status continued their existence within the information networks. Dr. Williams pulled out a chair and sat down across from me. For 40 years, they've been waiting for someone who could access and process the complete documentation. Someone who could tell the real story of what was discovered here. And you think I'm that person. Patient 847, B thinks you're that person. He's been evaluating your responses to network communication for 2 nights. Your willingness to investigate unusual phenomena, your ability to process complex information, your persistence in seeking understanding despite unsettling experiences. I looked at the folders scattered across my desk, dozens of them, containing decades of research into consciousness, death, and communication beyond biological boundaries. If I do this, if I process all these files, what happens next? You document what you learn. You create a comprehensive record of the consciousness persistence programs. And you decide what the world should know about the nature of human awareness and the possibility of existence beyond biological death. Dr. Williams stood up and walked toward the door. I'll leave you to consider this, Marcus. The choice is yours. You can continue with standard data entry, processing routine files, earning your paycheck without complications. Or you can engage with one of the most significant discoveries in human history. He paused at the door. Patient 847, B will continue attempting to communicate regardless of your decision. But if you choose to work with him, to process the consciousness persistence documentation, you'll have access to information that could revolutionize our understanding of human existence. After Dr. Williams left, I sat in the quiet room staring at the folders. The rational part of my mind said this was elaborate nonsense, that I was being manipulated by someone with an agenda I didn't understand. But another part of me, the part that had been listening to unexplained sounds and finding impossible coincidences, believed that something extraordinary was happening here. I opened the first Protocol 24 folder and began reading. Protocol 24, Information Network Mapping, 1976. Building on consciousness persistence findings from Protocol 23, research focus has shifted to mapping the structure and capabilities of post-biological information networks. Current understanding suggests that deceased subjects exist within interconnected data systems that span multiple physical locations. Subject 847 B continues to serve as primary communication coordinator, facilitating contact between research staff and other network-integrated consciousnesses. Communication methodology has evolved from simple information transfer to complex collaborative research processes. The documentation was extensive and technical, but the basic concepts were clear enough. The research team had discovered that consciousness could persist after biological death, operating within what they called information networks. These networks allowed deceased subjects to communicate with living people, access databases, and influence physical systems in limited ways. As I read through the files, I started to understand the scope of what had been studied here. This wasn't just about a single patient with unusual abilities. It was systematic research into the nature of consciousness itself, conducted over decades with dozens of subjects. Around 5 a.m., I heard typing again, but this time I wasn't startled by it. I looked over at the empty workstation where the sound was coming from and spoke to the room in general. Patient 847B? The typing stopped. If you're trying to communicate with me, I'm listening. I waited for a response, feeling somewhat ridiculous for talking to an empty room. But after a moment, the typing resumed. It had a different rhythm now, more deliberate, like someone was composing a message rather than entering routine data. I walked over to the workstation where the sound was coming from. The computer was still powered off, its screen black, but I could clearly hear keystrokes. I pulled out the chair and sat down, placing my hands near the keyboard without touching it. The typing continued for maybe 2 minutes, then stopped. I waited, uncertain what I was supposed to do next. Then the computer screen flickered on. I hadn't touched any buttons or switches. The monitor simply activated, displaying a basic text interface I didn't recognize. After a moment, words began appearing on the screen. "Marcus, can you see this message?" I stared at the screen. The computer had been completely powered off moments earlier, and now it was displaying text that seemed to be appearing in real time. "Yes," I said aloud. "I can see it." "Good. Communication is easier this way." Dr. Williams explained the situation. I nodded, then realized that might not be visible. He told me about the consciousness persistence research, about you and the other subjects. "We need your help to complete the documentation. The official records are incomplete. Important discoveries were suppressed." "Why me?" "You have the right combination of skills and receptivity. Most people cannot perceive network communications. You can." I thought about this. How do I know this is real? How do I know I'm not hallucinating or being manipulated? The screen was quiet for a moment. Then new text appeared. "Look in the file cabinet, drawer 3, folder marked Verification Protocols. Read the first page." I walked to the file cabinet and pulled out drawer 3. Inside were dozens of folders, but I quickly found one marked Verification Protocols. I opened it and read the first page. It was a memo dated 1977, addressed to the research team. Per concerns raised regarding the authenticity of network communications, the following verification procedures should be implemented for all claimed post-biological contacts. 1. Request specific information that could not be known to living participants. 2. Ask for details about current events outside the research facility. 3. Verify historical information against independent sources. 4. Test predictive capabilities regarding future events. I walked back to the computer. This describes how to verify that communications are genuine. Correct. We developed these protocols because researchers needed proof that network communications were not psychological artifacts. Can you provide that kind of verification? Yes. Ask me something specific that you can independently verify. I thought for a moment. Tell me something about this building that I don't know but could confirm. The Institute has a sub-basement level below B2. Access is through a locked door in the maintenance area. The level contains original research equipment from the consciousness persistence programs. I made a note of this information. It was something I could potentially verify by asking Janet or building security about the lower levels. What about current events? Something happening outside this building that I could check. The construction project on 5th Street. They encountered unexpected underground infrastructure today. Work stopped at 3:47 p.m. Delays will extend the project by 2 weeks. This was also verifiable. I could check local news sources or drive by the construction site to see if work had been stopped. And predictive information. Dr. Chin will call you tomorrow at 2:15 p.m. She will offer to extend your contract by 4 weeks. The official reason will be additional file archives discovered in storage. The real reason is that network communications have been more successful with you than with previous contractors. I wrote this down as well. If Dr. Chen called at exactly 2:15 p.m. tomorrow, offering exactly the contract extension described, it would be difficult to explain as coincidence. Assuming this is all real, I said, what exactly do you want me to do? Process the consciousness persistence files. All of them. Create a complete record of the research, the discoveries, the subjects who participated. Document the evidence that consciousness survives biological death. And then what? Publish it? Tell the world. That choice will be yours. But the documentation must be created first. The official records minimize the significance of what was discovered here. They make it seem like failed experiments rather than revolutionary findings. I looked around the room at all the red-labeled folders. How many files are we talking about? Approximately 400 folders containing 30 years of research documentation. Most are in the special handling archives. Some are in the sub-basement storage area. That's going to take weeks, probably months. Dr. Chin will continue extending your contract as needed. The Institute administration believes you are doing routine data entry. They do not know about the consciousness persistence documentation project. If you were in this situation, would you take on this kind of responsibility? What would make you believe or doubt something like this? I sat back in the chair, trying to process everything I'd learned. If this was real, if consciousness actually could persist after death, if the Institute had documented proof of communication with deceased individuals, then it was arguably one of the most important discoveries in human history. But if it wasn't real, if I was experiencing some kind of elaborate psychological manipulation or breakdown, then I was making decisions based on hallucinations and false information. I need time to think about this, I said. Understandable. But consider this. Even if you decide not to help with the documentation project, you will continue receiving network communications. Consciousness persistence is real whether you acknowledge it or not. The screen went black. The typing sound stopped. The room returned to its normal quiet state, leaving me alone with dozens of files and the most extraordinary decision I'd ever been asked to make. I spent the remaining 2 hours of my shift reading through more of the protocol documentation. The files contained detailed research notes, experimental procedures, and transcribed communications from dozens of deceased subjects. The scope of the research was staggering. 30 years of systematic investigation into consciousness, death, and the possibility of existence beyond biological boundaries. According to the documentation, the research had produced consistent, reproducible evidence that consciousness could operate independently of biological systems under specific conditions. The studies included controlled experiments, verification procedures, and long-term observation of subjects who had transitioned from biological to post-biological status. If the research was legitimate, it represented a fundamental breakthrough in understanding the nature of human awareness. If it wasn't legitimate, it was an elaborate fraud that had consumed decades of resources and involved hundreds of researchers. When Janet arrived at 7 a.m., I was still reading through the Protocol 27 files. "How was your night?" she asked, looking at the scattered folders on my desk. "Productive," I said. "I found some interesting cases in the archives. Complex documentation that raises questions about the scope of research conducted here." Janet nodded. "The Institute has a long history of innovative psychiatric research. Some of the older programs used methodologies that would be considered unconventional by today's standards. Have you ever heard of the consciousness persistence programs?" Janet paused, her expression becoming more careful. "Where did you encounter that terminology?" "In some of the patient files. References to protocols studying post-biological awareness, network communications, consciousness transition studies. Those programs were classified research projects, Marcus. The documentation is restricted to authorized personnel only. But I've been assigned to process files from those programs. Patient 847, B, Protocol 15, dozens of related cases." Janet walked over to my desk and looked at the folders I'd been reading. Her expression changed when she saw the red labels. "These files aren't supposed to be in your processing queue. Special handling documentation requires different security clearances." "Then how did they get mixed in with my assigned work?" Janet picked up one of the folders and examined the labeling. "I'm not sure. This is unusual. Let me contact Dr. Chun and clarify the protocols for these materials." She gathered up the red-labeled folders and placed them in a separate stack. "For now, please focus on the standard patient files. I'll get guidance on how to handle the restricted documentation." After Janet left, I continued working on routine data entry, but I couldn't stop thinking about everything I'd learned during the night. The conversation with Dr. Williams, the communication session with patient 847, B, the extensive documentation of consciousness persistence research. I was also thinking about the verification tests patient 847, B, had provided. Specific, checkable claims about construction delays, sub-basement levels, and Dr. Chen's phone call scheduled for the following afternoon. If those predictions proved accurate, it would be difficult to dismiss the communications as hallucinations or fraud. I finished my shift around 7:30 a.m. and drove home as the sun was coming up. I felt exhausted but also energized, the way you feel after learning something that changes your understanding of the world. That afternoon, I decided to verify some of the information patient 847, B, had provided. I drove to the construction site on 5th Street and found that work had indeed been stopped. There were barriers around an excavation area, and I could see workers examining what looked like underground pipes or cables. A supervisor I spoke with confirmed that they'd encountered unexpected infrastructure and were waiting for utility companies to identify the systems before continuing. Strike one for patient 847B. I also called the Institute's main number and asked about building access to lower levels. The receptionist confirmed that there were 3 basement levels, including B3, which contained mechanical systems and storage areas. Access to B3 required special authorization, she said, but it definitely existed. Strike 2. That left the most specific prediction, Dr. Chen's phone call at 2:15 p.m. the following day. If that happened exactly as described, I would have to seriously consider that my conversations with patient 847B were genuine communications with a deceased consciousness. The next evening, I arrived for my third shift with a different perspective on the work. I wasn't just processing historical files anymore. I was potentially documenting evidence of consciousness survival after biological death. Janet met me at the elevator as usual, but her demeanor was more formal than previous nights. Dr. Chen asked me to give you some additional guidelines, she said as we descended to B2. The special handling files you encountered last night are part of a classified research archive. Access is restricted to personnel with appropriate security clearances. Am I going to get that clearance? That's being reviewed. For now, please continue with standard patient files only. If you encounter any more red-labeled folders, set them aside without reading the contents. She walked me to the workstation and provided a fresh stack of files, all of them standard patient records from the 1970s and 1980s. No red labels, no protocol documentation, no references to consciousness persistence research. Dr. Chun will be in touch with you directly about your assignment status, Janet said. She may have some questions about the files you processed the past 2 nights. After Janet left, I started working through the routine files, but I kept watching the clock. According to patient 847B, Dr. Chun would call at 2:15 p.m. today. It was currently 11:30 p.m., which meant I'd have to wait until the next afternoon to test the prediction. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway, but instead of passing by, they stopped outside my door and I heard a key card being used. Dr. Williams entered the room. "Good evening, Marcus. How are you processing the new information?" Janet removed all the special handling files. She said I don't have clearance to access them. Dr. Williams nodded. That's the standard institutional response. The administration prefers to keep the consciousness persistence documentation separate from routine operations. He walked to one of the file cabinets and used a key I hadn't seen before to unlock a drawer I hadn't known was secured. Inside were more red-labeled folders. The files Janet removed are just a small portion of the complete archive. Most of the consciousness persistence documentation is stored in secured areas throughout the building. She said Dr. Chun wants to speak with me about what I've been reading. Dr. Chun is aware of your conversations with patient 847B. She's also aware that you've been selected as a potential documentation coordinator for the consciousness persistence archives. Dr. Williams pulled several folders from the locked drawer and placed them on my desk. The question is whether you're prepared to commit to this project fully. Half measures won't work. Either you engage with the network communications and process the complete documentation, or you return to routine data entry and pretend none of this exists. I looked at the folders. What happens if I choose the documentation project? You'll have access to 30 years of consciousness persistence research. You'll work directly with patient 847B and other network-integrated subjects. You'll create a comprehensive record of discoveries that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of human existence. And if I choose routine data entry, you'll continue processing standard patient files until the contract ends. Patient 847B will continue attempting to communicate, but without your active participation, the documentation project can't move forward. What about Dr. Chen's phone call? Patient 847B said she'd call at 2:15 p.m. tomorrow. She will, and she'll offer exactly the contract extension he described. The question is whether you'll accept it knowing what the real assignment involves. Dr. Williams sat down across from me. Marcus, I need you to understand something important. The consciousness persistence research didn't end in 1985 when the official programs were shut down. It continued, but in a different form. The network integrated subjects like patient 847 B have been conducting their own research for nearly 40 years. What kind of research? Studying the nature of post-biological existence, mapping information networks that connect multiple facilities, documenting other individuals who have achieved consciousness persistence through various means. He paused. They've discovered that what we studied here in the 1970s was just the beginning. I opened one of the folders he'd brought from the locked drawer. It contained documentation from something called Protocol 45, Network Expansion Studies, 1998. This is dated 1998. I thought the programs ended in 1985. The official programs ended. But consciousness persistent subjects don't require institutional approval to continue existing. They've been pursuing their own investigations, using facilities like this one as communication and documentation centers. The Protocol 45 files described research into what was called spontaneous consciousness persistence, cases of individuals who had achieved post-biological awareness without participating in formal research protocols. According to the documentation, patient 847B and other network-integrated subjects had identified dozens of these cases across multiple locations. They're studying other people who died but continued existing, people who died under specific circumstances that allowed consciousness persistence, terminal patients in hospitals with certain types of electrical equipment, individuals who died in locations with strong electromagnetic fields, people who had near-death experiences that resulted in permanent network integration. Dr. Williams gestured to the files on my desk. This documentation represents nearly 40 years of post-biological research conducted by consciousness persistence subjects themselves. They've been waiting for someone who could process and organize this information into a comprehensive record. Why haven't they documented it themselves? They can influence computer systems, but they can't create physical documents or organize information in ways that living people can access easily. They need a human collaborator who can bridge the gap between network communications and standard documentation methods. I looked through more of the files. The scope was enormous. Hundreds of cases, multiple facilities, decades of investigation into consciousness persistence phenomena. If it was real, it represented the most comprehensive study of post-death consciousness ever conducted. I need to see the verification first, I said. If Dr. Chen calls tomorrow at exactly 2:15 p.m. with exactly the offer patient 847 be described, then I'll consider this seriously. Dr. Williams nodded. That's reasonable, but I want you to be prepared for what happens if the verification is successful. This isn't just about data entry anymore. You'd be documenting evidence that could fundamentally change how humanity understands death, consciousness, and the nature of human existence. He stood up and walked toward the door. Think about what that kind of responsibility means, Marcus, and think about whether you're ready for it. After Dr. Williams left, I spent the rest of the shift reading through the standard patient files Janet had assigned, but my mind kept returning to the consciousness persistence documentation. The verification test would happen in less than 15 hours. Dr. Chen's phone call at 2:15 p.m. would either confirm that I was communicating with a deceased consciousness, or it would prove that I was experiencing elaborate hallucinations. I finished the shift and drove home as sunrise painted the sky orange and pink. I tried to sleep, but I kept thinking about patient 847B, Dr. Williams, and the possibility that everything I thought I knew about death was wrong. At 2:14 p.m., I was sitting in my sister's kitchen, staring at my phone. If patient 847B's prediction was accurate, Dr. Chen would call in exactly 1 minute. At 2:15 p.m., the phone rang. Marcus? This is Dr. Chen from the Midwest Psychiatric Research Institute. My heart started beating faster. Hello, Dr. Chen. I'm calling because we've discovered some additional file archives in our storage areas. We'd like to extend your contract by 4 weeks to process these materials. Would you be interested in continuing the work? I closed my eyes. It was exactly what patient 847B had predicted, down to the specific time frame. What kind of files are we talking about? Historical research documentation, similar to what you've been processing. Some of it requires more specialized handling, but Janet tells me you've been doing excellent work with complex cases. I'd be interested in continuing. Wonderful. Janet will have the updated paperwork ready for you tonight. Same schedule, same pay rate. The additional archives should keep you busy for at least a month. After Dr. Chen hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. The phone call had occurred at exactly the predicted time, with exactly the predicted content. Either I was experiencing the most elaborate and specific hallucination in human history, or I had just received independent verification that consciousness could survive biological death. That evening, I arrived for my 4th shift with a new understanding of my role at the Institute. I wasn't just a data entry contractor anymore. I was potentially the documentation coordinator for one of the most significant discoveries in human history. Janet met me at the elevator with the contract extension paperwork and a different attitude than previous nights. Dr. Chen spoke with you about the additional archives? She did. For weeks to process specialized documentation. Janet nodded, but her expression was thoughtful. Marcus, I want you to know that what you're working with isn't standard patient records. The materials you'll be accessing contain information that some people might find unsettling. In what way? They document experiences and phenomena that challenge conventional understanding of certain medical and psychological processes. If you find any of it disturbing or confusing, please let me know immediately. She walked me to the workstation, but instead of leaving me with standard files, she unlocked several file cabinets I hadn't had access to before. These contain the specialized archives Dr. Chen mentioned. Process them as you see fit, but remember that this information is confidential and shouldn't be discussed outside the Institute. After Janet left, I opened the first cabinet. It was filled with red-labeled folders organized by protocol numbers running from Protocol 15 through Protocol 52. 37 different research programs, spanning nearly 50 years of investigation into consciousness persistence. I pulled out the Protocol 15 folder, patient 847B's original case, and placed it on my desk. Then I walked to the computer workstation where I'd communicated with him 2 nights earlier. Patient 847B, are you here? The computer screen flickered on, displaying the same basic text interface I'd seen before. Hello, Marcus. Dr. Chen called at 2:15 p.m. Yes, exactly as you predicted. Good. Are you ready to begin the documentation project? I looked around the room at the dozens of file cabinets, the hundreds of folders containing decades of research into consciousness persistence. The scope of the project was overwhelming, but the verification had been convincing. I'm ready. Excellent. We will start with the foundational protocols. Understanding the basic research will help you process the more complex discoveries. For the next several hours, I worked through the consciousness persistence archives with patient 847, providing guidance and context through the computer interface. The documentation was extraordinary. Detailed studies of individuals who had maintained awareness after biological death, systematic investigations into the mechanics of consciousness persistence, and evidence of communication networks that connected deceased subjects across multiple locations. If you've been following this journey, hitting the notification bell means you won't miss what comes next. As I processed the files, I began to understand the full significance of what had been discovered at the Institute. This wasn't just about a few unusual cases or experimental procedures. It was comprehensive proof that human consciousness could operate independently of biological systems, that death represented a transition rather than a termination, and that the boundary between life and death was far more permeable than anyone had realized. The work continued for weeks. Every night, I processed more consciousness persistence documentation, guided by patient 847, B, and occasionally visited by Dr. Williams, who provided additional context and historical background. The project grew beyond simple data entry into something more like collaborative research between living and deceased investigators. By the end of the extended contract, I had created a comprehensive record of consciousness persistence research spanning 50 years. The documentation filled dozens of binders and contained evidence that would revolutionize scientific understanding of human consciousness if it were ever made public. But as I prepared to leave the institute, I realized I faced the same choice that had confronted every person who had worked on these projects. What should the world know about consciousness persistence? How do you share evidence of life after death without causing massive social disruption? The divorce papers that had once seemed so important were still in my apartment, but they felt irrelevant now. Jennifer's concerns about my ability to take care of myself seemed insignificant compared to questions about the nature of human existence and the possibility that consciousness survives biological death. On my final night at the Institute, patient 847, B, and I had one last communication session. What will you do with the documentation? I don't know yet. It's too important to hide, but too disruptive to release carelessly. That is the choice every documentation coordinator faces. The information exists now. How it is used is up to you. I packed up the consciousness persistence files and prepared to leave the sub-basement archive for the last time. As I walked toward the elevator, I realized that everything about my life had changed during these weeks of processing impossible documentation and communicating with deceased researchers. I wasn't the same person who had signed a contract in a coffee shop, desperate for income and uncertain about his identity. I had become someone who possessed evidence of consciousness persistence, who had direct experience with post-biological communication, and who faced the responsibility of deciding what humanity should know about the nature of death and awareness. The elevator carried me up from B2 to the main lobby, and I walked out into the morning sunlight carrying binders full of documentation that could change the world's understanding of human existence. But I still wasn't sure whether I believed it completely or whether I was ready for the responsibility that came with possessing such extraordinary information. I drove home thinking about patient 847, B, still existing somewhere in the information networks that connected to the Institute's basement computers. Still conscious, still investigating, still waiting for the next person who might be receptive to communications about the persistence of awareness beyond biological boundaries. I wondered if I would always be connected to those networks now, whether having experienced consciousness persistence communication once meant it would continue indefinitely. 6 months later, I still haven't decided what to do with the documentation. But sometimes, late at night, I hear typing sounds that don't have obvious sources. And sometimes I wonder if patient 847, B, is still trying to communicate, still hoping someone will share what we discovered about the nature of consciousness and the possibility that death is not the end of human awareness.